today we're going to be talking about Makola Market, and as one of the kind of landmark spaces in Accra, there's a few questions I'd like to ask about Makola to get the conversation going. So first of all, where is it?
Well, Makola used to be on the outskirts of Accra, believe it or not. Right now, it's pretty much at the center of the city, and it's the fulcrum for the city's colonial period and post-colonial early years business district of the city. So Makola is located in the heart of Accra.
And was it always in the heart?
Well, it started out, it was built actually in 1924. The 1920s was a period of intense construction in the city. It had begun with Gordon Gagisberg, who built Achimota Secondary School, which was a mega project involving acres and acres of landscape and construction and suburban planning.
And it was located out of the city in those days.
It was deliberately located 6 miles out of the city, not to disrupt the city too much, and also to give it the proverbial ivory tower feel.
Right.
He also did Kolubu,
the hospital.
And then further afield, Takrady Market. He was a man of extraordinary vision. And I believe, even though the literature doesn't support it, he belongs to a group of Britons who saw that the days of the colonial empire was coming to
an end, even as far back as 1920.
Well, they had survived the First World War, 1914 to 1917. So the 1920s was within memory.
Yep.
And they probably saw the desiccation that the war imposed upon Britain and figured that they cannot continue like that. But obviously he had to overcome a lot of prejudice. He began, however, by trying to build infrastructure. Hence the units I mentioned. But in the 20s, the Supreme Court was built. And that was really the one main imperial building of the colonial period, with the Corinthian columns, the whole panoply of European.
And the Supreme Court essentially abuts the area that is Makola Market now.
So that area where Makola Market sits was an iconic area where you had the Supreme Court. Further up, you had the neo-Gothic Anglican Cathedral, which was fairly close. Then, well, other major buildings came, but later. But let's say at the period we're talking about, the post office was also located there. So it's a nexus of fairly important buildings. The Accra was expanding. Up till then, the major markets in Accra was Slaga Market and London Market. Then, of course, there were tributary markets. There was Osu Market. But it was obvious that the city needed a bigger landmass for selling things. So that's how Makola came into the frame.
And I heard somewhere that even the word Makola, it meant the place where they sold the kola nuts. Is that correct?
No. But it's not a Ga word, but I'll get to it.
Okay.
So Makola, the space was a ravine lying between a ridge and the downtown area. The ridge had gained prominence because racial segregation had begun around that period. When the English were here as traders, they lived as close to the sea as they could in order to inspect the ships as they came down. But their mortality rate was horrible. They died like flies. Eventually, when the British government took over the settlement and declared it a colony, it could no longer, for political reasons, afford that high death rate. So it brought in a consultant from the English army in India to come and advise on what to do. The consultant came and looked at the living conditions of the English people and said, look, this place is full of disease, tropical diseases that are totally foreign to the European body. And we don't have any built-in immunity, unlike the natives who he declared were immune to all these diseases. So consequently, you could leave them where they are. But if you want Europeans to survive, you have to separate them. Well, that was the reason given. But if you look at the history of the period, Hitler was formulating his
ideas about racial purity.
And a couple of other places, the whole idea
South
of
Africa,
racial purity was springing up. And they were all looking for the right excuses to justify it. Anyway, that's what they did in Accra. So they chose selected points, the ridge, and other high points to settle the Europeans. Why? Because they believed that disease was spread by air, by the wind. So you have to be upwind and let the disease flow down. And so they chose upwind locations like the ridge. Apart from the ridge, they created space at Adabraka where their servants would live. But the servants, it became quite clear that the Europeans could not live too far from their servants, because at night, you still needed someone to serve dinner and to clean up. So that idea fell down. What they did was they came up with the boys' quarters, which, funnily enough, we still have here today. And the boys' quarters helped to resolve that problem. But there was still Adabraka, and the African bourgeoisie, the lawyers and the doctors who were living at Jamestown, followed the exodus of the Europeans who were going to the ridge, and they went to Adabraka and established themselves there.
So would you say Adabraka was the first kind of middle-class Ghanaian enclave?
Tudu,
was
the first one. Tudu was established after the Asantewaa War.
Right.
When a Captain Glover brought an expeditionary Hausa militia to come and help the British to fight that war. Upon the conclusion of the war, they were on their way home when they were garrisoned at Tudu, and many of them chose to stay there. So what happened now is Accra was expanding, the city was opening up, it needed a big market to absorb all the food that was being brought in from the outskirts, from the hinterlands. So Makola was the ideal place they chose for it. And that explains the location of Makola. There was the big Hausa community at Tudu, ex-servicemen who had bivouacked there and were living there. They became cattle slaughterers and breeders. And they were getting their cattle from the Captain Brima, who was a major cattle importer from Nigeria. And he was supplying, he had a ranch at Nima, and he was supplying the city of Accra with a lot of his beef. The beef was being slaughtered at Nima and retailed in Tudu. There was another group of Nigerian migrants living in what is now Cow Lane, and they specialized in selling vegetables and herbs. The two Nigerian groups met at Makola and sell their products. The Gas were mainly along the coastline or scattered in villages beyond Achimota. But they all began to congregate at Makola to buy stuff, and hence the location.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the name is kind of interesting because it's a Yoruba name.
Yeah.
Meaning, well, I've heard various interpretations, but essentially, it's a meeting place, a people where people meet. And since it was established by Nigerians, they gave it that name.
Okay. So it's not even a Ghanaian name?
No, it's not a Ghanaian name. It's a Nigerian name, but which has been so transmogrified that it's now practically a Ghanaian word.
Yes. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting for me about Makola, there's a number of things, but one is its endurance. So, even over the past 50, 60 years, as we've moved to shopping malls and strip malls and, larger scale retail outlets, this still retains its character as the primary.
It does, because it is essentially a place where people met. Mm-hmm. When I was mayor and we had to rehabilitate, redesign Makola, Frank Taki was our main consultant. And we all agreed that we will use the occasion to decongest the downtown area. We all agreed that Makola was one of the main congestants, causes of congestion, because so many people came there to shop. So we all agreed that they came there to shop for food. People would walk from Adaptation to Makola to buy 1 cup of salt. It wasn't so much the transfer of merchandise as an opportunity to meet people.
Right.
That's where you went to hear the latest gossip. Mm-hmm. That's where you went to complain about somebody. That's where you went and met people of your community.
Right.
And that accounts for its traction. Mm-hmm. We never understood that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm not quite sure that we have yet understood that. But it is a space which is, frankly, riddled with African conceptions.
Explain that a bit more.
Okay. When I was mayor, I learned that the AMA had responsibility legally.
That's the Accra Metropolitan Assembly,
had the legal responsibility for establishing markets in the city.
Right.
You can only establish a market with the authority of the
AMA
assembly. You can only build a new market with the authority of the city. Accra was expanding very fast, and we came under pressure to try and build new markets or rehabilitate existing ones. I remember building a market somewhere on the outskirts, beautiful market, and we expected that we would get the ladies jumping with joy at this opportunity. To our surprise, they were not interested. We showed them the new stalls, the new shops, the daycare center, what have you, and they were not biting. So I remember I went to, somebody advised me, go and ask the old lady. She may tell you something you need to know. So there was an old lady with whom we deal with for community problems. So I went and told her, why is it that we are not getting any interest in this market? And she said, yes, I have been there and I know why. And I said, why? She said, because there's too much concrete. So do you mean concrete? He said, young man, when you are a trader in Makola, you can bet that you will probably meet 100 people a day wanting something. You can bet that a fair proportion of them may not be corporeal. They may be spirits. I said, oh, that's interesting. He said, yes. We have to deal with a lot of unrealities, irrealities here. And spirits coming down to buy stuff for their own ends is not unusual. I said, so what's that got to do with that? The result is that every Makola trader has to protect herself spiritually. So if you go into any of those stores, there's always a little corner where a shrine is being created, either underground or up the wall. Your new market does not give ground for that. I said, well, how come we were not told? He said, well, did you ask us? Of course, it would not have occurred to my band of engineers and sociologists to ask such a question. Okay. The tenacity of Makola is that it's frankly riddled with these kinds of Ghanaian beliefs. So when you go there, I mean, when it's like going to your mommy's shop. When I was a teenager at Kimbu, most of my friends were children of Makola traders. So for lunch, we would all go to Makola and buy food to come and eat. So it was a background to our growing. So it's quite natural that we think of it as something integral to our growing up here in Accra. And you ignore that at your peril.
So let me ask you this. You know, I remember as a child going around Makola with my grandmother and my aunts, who would explain, for example, that the way things were organized was organized according to local recipes, for example. So the tomatoes would be next to the onions, would be next to okra, because that's how you made okra stew. But when you go to Makola now, what is the organizing principle?
That really is a result of our fumbling attempt to clear Makola of foodstuff, because it was contributing mightily to the sanitation problems of the city. Makola was placed where it is because it was on the route from the hinterland to Accra. And when farmers brought their foodstuff, they sold it to the retailers at Makola. And people from Accra would go down and buy and take it to their homesteads. At the end of the day, if some of the perishable goods are not sold, they dump them into the gutters. And it was a hell of a situation for the city to clear. So when we decided to reclaim Makola, it was one of the first ideas: banish raw foods from there and replace it with dry goods like cloth, like metal, stuff like that. And so it's been there for quite a while. It has not worked. We realized too late that you cannot banish food from the central market. we try to make up for it by building Agbogloshi, which worked to a certain extent. But Makola still had historical traction in the imagination of African people. And there are very few successful residents of Accra, especially the girls from the Jamestown, Gamachin area, whose mothers did not trade at one time or the other. Makola.
So they have these deep emotional and historical ties to the place.
Deep emotional ties to the place.
Yeah.
It is presenting problems today because as we sit, the whole concept of market is changing.
Yep.
With the Accra Mall and the various malls sprinkled, it's now a different demographic.
Yep.
Young kids who are used to ordering things online, or young kids who are used to air-conditioned malls. But for a significant population, Makola, with its heat, its smells, its noise, is still the place to go.
So do you think that eventually, as that older population who have these ties to a place like Makola, do you think it will eventually disappear?
I don't know whether it will disappear, but it will be whittled down a lot.
Yeah.
As you note, a sort of vertical shopping mall had been erected right next to it.
Yeah.
Also, the complexity of Makola is changing. Today, you actually have Chinese merchants who are squatting on the floor with their goods, selling stuff. Of course, you've had non-guards there since time immemorial, the Paus and the Trees, the Evers. But today, you are beginning to see the Chinese. So, Makola is changing. How fast depends on factors which I cannot predict. But I know that it's happening now.
But it's really interesting you say that one of the driving forces for this market was the fact that it was a place to meet.
Yes.
And in a way, the mall has become a place to meet.
The
like
mall
if you see the number of people who go into shops, it's probably smaller than the people who are hanging out there. So there's something about the social space.
Yes. It's somewhere where Africans meet and talk and just loll around.
Yeah.
And hence Makola.
And I mean, do you see the nature of the things that are being sold in Makola really beginning to change with the times? So I mean, now you see electronics, you see mobile phones, you see all of the kind of paraphernalia of, I guess, modernity, but at the same time you still see yam and cassava and tomatoes, which I presume are controlled by the same farmers, distributors as they were.
Well, Makola is a very successful selling emporium, and it has succeeded by adapting itself to the market tastes. And obviously today, mobile phones is something that people want. Even the carriers, the young girls who carry goods for the traders as well as the people who patronize Makola. Even they walk around with mobile phones to keep in touch with their clients. And they are organizing themselves so that their clients tell them in advance that I'll be coming there on Tuesday around 10. I'll be looking for XYZ stuff. And they go and they do a pre-shopping. And when the clients come, they just whisk them around.
So you said something again that's also very interesting for me, because I'm very interested in the gender dynamics in places like Makola. And I don't remember who told me this, and you'll have to correct me if this is an urban myth. But I remember being told that the queen traders, you know, the yam queen, the tomato queen, the women the very powerful women who controlled the distribution of foodstuffs, were referred to as Nkrumah's brides. And when they turned against him.
I never heard the term Nkrumah's bride. But they were some of the earliest supporters of Nkrumah. Don't forget that they also had their problems with the British colonial government with respect to credit, with respect to getting financing from the banks to do their project. And the colonial government was certainly far more interested in supporting the Kingsways and the UTCs than in
the big supermarkets.
Than in these women. And so when Nkrumah came, he deliberately courted them. And the whole idea of the market queen emanated from that period, where certain women were chosen, obviously for their fidelity to the party, but were chosen to represent the women in various negotiations with the powers that be, and who eventually became the Mamma Mias of the market.
And are they still, is the trade still dominated by...
Still dominated. You'll be foolish to go to market to try and do anything without the blessing of a market queen. They are useful. They help young girls enter into the trade. They give them guidance on how to maneuver around it. They give them mentors to mentor them as they move looking for business. They teach them the tricks of the trade. And when the girls have problems, as young girls would invariably do, they are there to lend a hand. I know when I was mayor that you cannot have any social outreach without involving them. Things like childhood diseases eradication, things like getting kids to go to school. All this is facilitated by having the market queens on your side. So they are quite a powerful group.
And are they still generally Ga women, or are they from all over?
Not necessarily. Now they come from
all over Ghana.
All over. Ghana. But then there were quite a number of Ga women, yes.
And I mean, a couple of final questions, about Makola. I remember when the big market at Kaneshi was being built. I presume it was an attempt to draw business or to decongest Makola, as you said.
The decongestion.
Why did this project not work?
Kaneshi is working.
But it works. What I'm seeing is that it's a replica of Makola in that people are on the streets trading, and there's this huge building behind it, which is not used as a marketplace. It's
because the dynamics have changed. A lot of Accra has expanded. There's a lot more traffic, a lot more people in a hurry to go from one place to another. Makola was built at a time of leisure for people who were walking there and would take their time to meander through and shop. Today's demographic has changed. The young people are in a hurry. They don't have the time to loiter and meander around. And quite frankly, they find it easier to buy things on the street side. And Makola recognizes it. So a lot of the women inside there send goods to their children on the streets to sell for them. So that's how Makola has kept. Makola does not like it because it means that there's much less activity for them within the market. But still there's plenty.
I mean, fascinating to draw a kind of mental map of the retail routes, the negotiations. I can kind of picture it spatially, but we don't really have a form yet for that kind of activity.
It's incredibly complicated. I was talking to a friend who is quite knowledgeable about Makola and his trading. I mean, there are places where second-hand clothes are sorted out, cleaned, prepared, and resold. And then men with this heavy iron, serious iron, that you put in the coal fire, take it out, rub it on the clothes. It's a whole production. And it's out there. somewhere on Makola.
Wow.
Sure. And then they have an internal financing system.
Yes, yes.
Because they need money
Yeah.
all the time. So they have runners who go to their private bankers to collect huge wads of cash and bring it for distribution.
Yeah.
You don't hear about this, you don't hear about it.
Yeah.
But that's how Makola has grown over the years. And it's very effective from that point of view.
I mean, one of the first things I learned, I think, as an architecture student was that if you can represent a system in the abstract, you start to be able to understand it in its complexity. And it seems to me that, here we have this space where you have retail, you have finance, you have relationships, you have history, you have emotions, you have spirits. I mean, the kind of mental map of this place is amazing.
Oh, it is amazing now that you put it that way. And I'm not sure how much of it has become concretized yet. Okay. I became interested because I was a mayor, and as such, I had a lot to do with the women who ran Makola, and learned quite a bit from them. So I can talk about it.
So can I just to kind of wrap this session up, but can I ask you if your training as an architect was useful, in your tenure as mayor, to understand the complexities of some of these systems? You can say no. But
not particularly, because the city is vast and its complexity is unbelievable. After the fact, I could apply some of my architectural perspectives, but in the heat of the moment, not particularly.
No, you're making decisions. You have to make decisions literally on the hook.
Yes.
And as a historian, I mean, I'm presuming that also the training as a historian also allows you to see.
Well, I wasn't much of a historian when I was there.
Okay.
Because, like I said, the problems are so intractable and they just come whirling at you. It was after I had ended my period that I started looking back to try and figure out what had happened. There was very little exposure to institutional memory. The civil servants who were there were not historians, they were just civil servants. If you dredge them, if you push them far enough, they begin to tell you some historical details, but not in the way that a trained historian would do.
Right.
Of trying to get cause, effect, and align them together. But I was forced to begin to look at Accra as a historical experience, especially again as a result of my Makola. Because it burnt down in 1993, I think. And Rawlings came and promised to rehabilitate it, rebuild it. And then threw that in the laps of Smiths and the AMA. So we got to work. We took down the names of all the people who were traders there and who said they had lost their goods at the shops, and promised them that after we had built, we would invite them back. So 3-4 years later, we had completed the structures and we invited them, and we put in the paper that we had the names of all those who claimed to have lost things, that they should come. They came and we had a joyous reunion. 2 days later, the city erupted in protests. A lot of women took to the street to denounce AMA for giving their birthrights to the girlfriends of high officials. And I was kind of thrown aback. So I asked my director, can you please tell me what's happening? They did some research and then came up with the story that when Makola was built in the 1920s, it was located on a ravine which was taboo to the Ga people because that's where women who died in childbirth or armed robbers who were killed, their bodies were thrown into that ravine. The only people who would go and trade there were the Nigerians at Tudu and Kaole. The Gans preferred Slaha and London. Anyway, eventually, Makola became popular. So in the 1920s, when the British decided that they wanted to build a market to take away the raw food from the coast, they chose Makola's site. They built the market, and the first people who bought the facility were Nigerians. When I say Nigerians, these are people who carried Nigerian names, but who had been migrants in this place for generations, living in Jamestown, living in Tudu, living in various other places. And they are the ones who bought it. Of course, first generation shopped there, second generation held there. Then that kids started going to university, but they still held on to the deeds. So when we invited the owners to come, the people who came were renting from them.
Right. Not the original.
Not the original owners. Yes. They were renting from them. And they came, and that's how the original owners found out that we were giving away their birthright, and we were very incensed. That's invaluable history.
Yeah.
I wish I had known that.
Yeah.
When we planned the whole thing.
So one curious thing that you've just said that's sticking in my mind is, what is the relationship between women who die in childbirth and armed robbers? I mean,
because it was taboo for the girls.
So both circumstances are taboo?
Yes. For the girls, death in childbirth brings together two very powerful spiritual emotions. Giving birth, bringing life, and living life. And when
those two things
come together, it is a major calamity. And a calamity whose impact spreads on the whole family. So you get rid of the evidence. So in those days, sure, that's what they did.
And armed robbery? I mean,
and armed robbery, obviously, everybody lives in fear.
In fear, yeah.
And in the 1920s, the Yasantua War had ended not so long before. The slave trade had been abolished. But Accra was full of formerly freed slaves who didn't have much to do, too far away from their homes to go back, willing to go back. Ex-servicemen who had fought in all these colonial battles and were just around looking.
Yeah.
Okay. So it was not a particularly safe place.
Yeah.
Kidnappers still went around looking for unwary victims and kidnapping them to sell into slavery. So it was a time when people had reason to be afraid. So when somebody was accused of armed robbery, the police was not very well established. Captain Glover brought a Nigerian militia to help the British fight the Yasantua War. When that war was over, the militia stayed and went to form the nucleus of the police force in Accra.
Yeah.
So you can imagine that period. They needed a strong security network. So a lot of people took the law into their own hands. When you are accused of armed robbery, you were executed summarily and your body thrown away.
So I mean, it's such a powerful note, I think, to end on in a way. And it takes me back to that story of the trader who is trading in the presence of spirits who are coming. So in the ravine, where the market sits, you have the bodies of women for whom these two great fears, death and life, have come together, and young men, I presume, who strike at the very heart of the community, the community's own safety. So it's a very powerful set of...
Extremely so. Extremely so.
Both historical and emotional currents, let's say, that are swirling around this place. Yeah.
So when that lady told me that the traders need spiritual protection, it is based upon many sediments.
Many layers of this.
Many layers of experience.
And history.
History, yes.
Matt, thank you so much for spending time with me today. This has been amazing.